I'm joining you from Kampala, Uganda. It's just 8 a.m. on Monday morning here, and I'm delighted to chair this session. I will introduce our panelists in a little while, but first I'd like to help us frame the discussion for this panel. We are all aware that we are only 8 years away from the magic moment when we should have achieved the ambitious targets set out in the SDG 2030 agenda, but that we are not as far along towards achieving those targets as we would like. I'm a member of the technical advisory group that is supporting the Global Commission on Science Missions for Sustainability. Our role is to figure out a mechanism by which we can mobilize global funding to support so-called science missions. This mission-driven science recognizes that while the SDG agenda is concerned with addressing global challenges, these global challenges are not experienced in the same way in every context across the globe. And so for the science to be effective in generating solutions to these global challenges, the context has to be taken into account. At the same time, the science research funding and technical capacity are unequally spread out across the globe. The number of scientists per million in the global north, for instance, stands at just under 5,000 per million, while that in the global south is just over 700 scientists per million. That is a 7-fold difference. At the same time, national research funding can be as high as 3% of GDP in some countries in the global north, and as low as 0.01% of the GDP in some countries in the global south. 0.01 of an already small GDP, mind you, and this tells you that not much science is going on, let alone science that addresses the global SDG goals. And yet, global progress towards the SDGs cannot be made by science being produced in just a few places, because that science will inevitably underspecify the global nature of the issues being investigated. The global pandemic is a good example of the fact that without the right science in place at the right time, policymakers, decision makers, governments will flounder. We are all well aware of the unexpected ways in which different populations experienced and responded to the coronavirus, sometimes in ways that were completely different from what was predicted. We are also aware that because of this, there were some ill-fitting policy decisions made because of the absence of contextually accurate science. In my country, Uganda, for instance, we instituted total lockdowns that lasted for months. And by the end of it, we had achieved 0 deaths due to coronavirus, but the deaths due to TB had risen to as much as 12 per day. And the prolonged lockdowns have resulted in hundreds of thousands of teenage pregnancies and children losing up to 2 or 3 years of schooling. At the same time, however, the global pandemic has shown us that partnerships and resources can be quickly organized in response, that data can be shared across the public and private sectors, and in fact, that we could successfully and efficiently respond to a global health crisis. This gives us hope that we can similarly partner to address the other longer-term crises such as climate change and biodiversity loss. But what data infrastructures are needed to achieve this? So the questions for the data community include things like, given the abundance of data in some domains and some geographies compared to the scarcity in other domains and geography, what action needs to be taken and by whom to ensure that adequate data can be generated and that this data can be integrated to produce a fuller picture of the physical and social reality that we live in, so that we can address and make the desired progress towards the SDG targets. And how can we bridge the science and policy divide so as to bring this science to action? Our panelists today span this landscape, and I am looking forward to hearing their interventions. Our first speaker, Dr. Christopher Murray, will kick us off with a particularly good example of a global collaboration around a global issue, and he is the director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluations in the United States, which coordinates the Global Burden of Disease study. Dr. Murray is a physician and health economist and has dedicated his career to improving population health worldwide through better evidence, work for which he has been nationally and internationally recognized. His work was especially essential to the critical analysis during the COVID-19 pandemic, by which we understood its impact on health systems and the population as a whole, and the effectiveness of policy interventions to mitigate it. Dr. Murray was unfortunately not able to join us in person, nor was he able to join us virtually, so we shall listen to a pre-recorded talk from him titled From Data to Policy Relevant Scenarios. Host, would you like to run that video?
Like to talk about some of our experiences at IHME on the use of data for problems of global impact. And I'm going to touch on both the global burden of disease and our experience with COVID-19 forecasting. First, a little bit about the Institute. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation was founded in 2007, and we've grown up to be about 500 people. And fundamentally, the Institute is an organization committed to producing global public goods through a very broad-based collaboration of scientists from around the world. And our global public goods fall naturally into three large groups. The global burden of disease, our attempt to quantify health outcomes and drivers of health for every country in the world and for subnational units in 20 plus countries. Our effort on tracking money for health called Financing Global Health. And then our effort to produce a set of comprehensive forecasts by country for all the outcomes in the global burden of disease going out to the year 2100 and alternative scenarios, which of course with great uncertainty in all aspects of the forecasting. Now we take a collaborative model to trying to produce these global public goods. And this map shows you the nearly 8,000 collaborators that we have around the world, and highlights that there are certain countries where we have a very large number of collaborators, such as Ethiopia or Iran or India or the US or Australia. But we have a large number of collaborators in many countries. And that's been a key part of our model of bringing science to bear on this, of making sense of data. Now, of course, with such a large collaboration, so many hundreds of thousands of data sets and sources going into the global burden of disease, there's quite a complex and elaborate governance structure that helps figure out how we come to a coherent set of observations across so many contributors. Now, in trying to make sense of data, like everybody else, we have had to tackle the main challenges in trying to measure indicators at the country level over time. Inconsistent coding and case definitions, depending on what you're studying. Country years where there's no data at all, but still a need for making assessments to drive current policy choice. The more common problem, or as common a problem, where there are more than one study or survey that give very different answers. The challenge that everybody knows how to deal with of sampling error due to sample size or the way you sample for data, but the much less standardized challenge of non-sampling error. Everything from interviewers not going to a village because in the rainy season, to a host of issues around different assays and approaches, or different instruments and surveys being used. And then lastly, as people use administrative data, and we certainly use a lot of administrative data, there is the challenge that those in greatest need, the poor or the discriminated against, may often be excluded from administrative data sets. Over the 30 years of the Global Burden of Disease effort, we have developed a series of approaches that try to address these generalized problems. Review of every data source for quality, what we call statistical crosswalking, or adjusting data collected with non-optimal assays or definitions or instruments, so that we can use all the data that's available and not only use the small subset of data that may be the preferred measurement method. And then last, the development over decades of a toolkit of Bayesian statistical methods to help with the task of data synthesis. Now, another way to think of that analytic process, which is very relevant to International Data Week, is that there's 4 steps in our way of thinking of getting from data to sense making and helping inform policy choice. The first is a sort of comprehensive view of the data. That's not going to be a surprise. And in our experience, there's a role for, of course, public sector data, but there's also a role for many ancillary data sources collected by the private sector. For example, cell phone data for mobility that was used in COVID, or satellite imagery data from vendors that have global coverage that can be used for a variety of analytic steps, or electronic medical record compendia that are often put together by third parties. But regardless of the universe of data that you have, there is a whole area of data processing which gets much less discussion, but is absolutely fundamental to making sense of data. A good example of this is vital statistics. Even if you have a complete vital statistics system capturing every death, there's still a real challenge of comparable measurement across place and over time because of differences in how certification of deaths is conducted and how that can lead to differences in coding. And over the years, we have developed a range of methods to try to enhance comparability as one example of that critical process, step in data processing. The third step is data synthesis, where in maybe years gone by, many groups would have used a very individualized or personalized approach. This is the data set I trust the most. Whereas we have over time moved towards more replicable statistical approaches to data synthesis that allow others to get the same answer if they see the same data and apply the same code. And then last, to get to policy relevance, we strongly see the value of forecasting what's likely to occur and what are alternative trajectories, so that a decision maker can see how their actions can change or bend the curve, so to speak, into the future. And there's a whole series of methods required to do the forecasting in a reasonable way. Now, we have also learned through this process that you need to release the same information in many ways to reach different and equally important audiences. So to assure credibility of what we do on the GBD, we produce peer-reviewed publications. The last round of the Global Burden of Disease had some 400 publications in the peer-reviewed literature. But we also release a database that can be instantly queried and downloaded called GBD Compare, and the GBD Results tool. An illustration is shown on the top right online, so that anybody can access the results in extraordinary detail. And then lastly, through our network of collaborators, there is a large number of policy documents produced country by country, and here's 2 illustrations produced by the local collaboration teams. So that's one example of how, in a very systematic, comprehensive way, we use data at IHME with collaborators to drive the annual assessment of a GBD. Now, another example of data has been our pivot to modeling COVID. So when COVID hit the state of Washington, it was the first place with community transmission in the US in late February. We started modeling for our own state what was likely to occur for COVID, Very quickly, we were asked by other states and hospital systems to model across the US. So on March 26th of 2020, we started releasing results for all 50 US states, and then in short order moved on to modeling all countries in the world. But this journey has been quite complicated because we have learned through science and the sort of intensive work on research of COVID, so many things we didn't know at the beginning that led us to have to revise the modeling approach. And so we made one major change within the first 6 weeks and switched to a transmission dynamics modeling framework, which was what we call quasi-mechanistic. Namely, there was a mechanistic part about transmission, but there was also a statistical part about fitting these transmission models to each location, reflecting the drivers of transmission, such as mask use or mobility. Then we had to take into account vaccination as the miracle of rapid deployment of vaccines took place, and take into account who was fortunate enough to get vaccines. And then as the new variants started to emerge, we've had to revise the model to reflect new variants. And then as we learned that immunity wanes from vaccination and wanes from natural infection, we had to make a major change in the fall or the late in the year in 2021 to very explicitly capture waning immunity. So along that journey, what were the key things that we learned about producing forecasts on a weekly basis for every country in the world that had COVID? First, we had to develop statistical approaches to make sense of the data, our usual task in the GBD, but done on a weekly basis. And that meant triangulating off reported cases, reported hospitalizations, and reported deaths, and seroprevalence data to make sense of what likely daily infections were in each country. Then we modeled transmission in the past as a function of mask use, testing, social distancing mandates, mobility, seasonality, vaccination, boosters, and variant spread. And then we project into the future, forecasting vaccination, taking into account vaccine hesitancy and supply and delivery, variant spread from country to country. You know, think back to Omicron and how quickly it spread from South Africa to other parts of the world. And then, as I've mentioned, taking into account the evidence as it keeps accumulating on waning vaccine-derived and infection-derived immunity, and this complex matrix of cross-variant immunity between each of the variants, including, for example, subvariants of Omicron like BA2, 4, and 5. Here's an illustration, and for those of you who are actually interested in the detail, it's published in a paper in April in the medical journal The Lancet. Ryan Barber is the lead author. But basically, it's our template that we had to develop iteratively to make sense of the available data. And so this shows reported cases on the top left in green, reported hospitalizations in blue, reported deaths in red. It shows the different waves in South Africa. Of course, we show this differently for each country of the variants. And then in the middle column, we have the information on the infection detection rate that we calculate by comparing seroprevalence data to reported cases, the infection hospitalization rate, and the infection fatality rate. And on the top right is our best estimate, triangulated estimate of infections. The middle panel on the right is comparing estimates of cumulative infections to seroprevalence data, or I should say cumulative infected of individuals. And the bottom right is just the transmission parameter and how it varies over time. The key message here is to the need to rapidly develop analytic frameworks that allow us to keep track of what's happening to the true quantity of interest, which in this case is infection, because that's the only way you're going to build a transmission model that could be used for forecasting. Now, I've mentioned that we had to elaborate our model for waning immunity. I won't go into the math, but it took actually more time than we would have liked to develop this. Fortunately, we had been working on this well before Omicron hit, but from the time when Omicron was announced to the world by South Africa, it took us nearly 3.5 weeks to have models for every country in the world where we felt reasonably confident of the pattern of spread and transmission, taking into account vaccination and waning immunity. And it turned out that our forecast, particularly for Omicron, turned out to be actually really quite good. Now, in general, we need to keep track of the performance of different modeling teams. This is not really evaluation of performance of a particular model, because everybody's model had to keep changing as the pandemic evolved. It's more about which group of modelers did a reasonable job of keeping up and producing forecasts. And there's a lot to digest here. On the left is for the US, on the right is for Latin America. Many more modeling groups contributing to modeling in the US. And some models did quite well. The lowest error over time that it was operating for the US was a model by an individual called YYG, a machine learning model, but he only produced forecasts for the first 4 or 5 months of the pandemic. The red line is our model, which is the next best, but we've been running throughout the pandemic. And what's interesting here is that the absolute value of error in the forecast per capita only slowly increases over time. And so this is in contrast to models where error, such as shown here in yellow, it gets dramatically worse the farther you forecast out. And I think there's some important lessons. We're trying to bring all these lessons together for the future of COVID and for the future of modeling pandemics. But the bottom line is we do need to track performance out of sample, like how good are different teams at forecasting, and then try to make sense of what's quite a complicated thing, which is some models do well in some places for a short period of time. Other models may do better in other locations. And if we can learn what attributes of those models contributed to that, we'll all be in a better place for the future. Now, another thing that we learned was the critical importance of releasing our forecasts through multiple mechanisms. We put everything online. And if you just Google IHME COVID-19, you'll go straight to our online visualization. We produced scientific papers. Here's one example of a paper in Nature Medicine on modeling COVID-19 for the US. We produced tailored policy briefs for senior political leaders in many countries, written both with a lot of data and figures and tables, but with this one-page synthesis of making sense of the pandemic each week and what were the main insights. And then we had an executive summary that went out to a larger audience than those tailored policy briefs shown on the far left. And then on top of that, of late in the last few months, we've also had a video release of talking about the main highlights that also is another vehicle through social media to communicate the results. And all of these have served to reach different audiences. This in turn has generated a lot of press interest at various times. And so we do press briefings. And across some of the leaders here at IHME, we have had hundreds of television appearances talking about some aspects of COVID or our forecasts. So some key high-level lessons, and I'll end here. Policy relevance really requires you being up to date. When you talk to a minister of health or to a prime minister or a leader of a regional organization, they are only want to listen if you reflect the state right now and also can opine with data on current policy debates. Secondly, modeling is not a one-off task. You don't build a nice model and run it over and over. You've got to keep up with how scientific knowledge is changing. In the case of something like COVID-19, that change is almost weekly, but it is changing on a very rapid rate. And of course, new variants are emerging, new tools are emerging. Think about the dominant role now in discussions around antivirals, and we didn't really have those antivirals a year ago. Now, the most impact we've had is through direct policy brief and direct communication with political leaders and technical leaders of health systems through this much more tailored briefing material direct to the concerns that they have. It's labor intensive, but is more effective than the broader communication strategies. And last, I'd like to highlight how important it has been to collaborate with WHO regional offices, because they have been so directly engaged in helping member states in their regions navigate difficult choices during COVID. And so that's been a real high point of our experience during COVID. And I think shows how there's a synergy between the data and the analytics. And organizations committed to working closely with governments and helping them through challenging technical choice. So thank you for your attention and your interest in IHME's experience in the use of data.
A very comprehensive and thought-provoking talk from Dr. Mari there, and a robust example of the role of data in responding to a quickly evolving global pandemic and an impressive mobilization of global actors in the effort. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, and we also know that there are people on site, so please do keep those questions so we can get to them at the end. And to follow on from Dr. Mari, we'll hear from Ms. Yana Gevorgian, I hope I mentioned that correctly, who will take up the discussion with a talk titled Improving Our World Through Open Knowledge, where we hope she will throw more light on successful initiatives to collect global data for the SDGs. Ms. Gevorgian, if you don't mind, I'll call you Yana, heads the Intergovernmental Group on Earth Observation, or GEO for short, headquartered in the United States. GEO brings together government institutions, academic and research institutions, businesses, civil society, non-governmental organizations, and other professionals to harness the power of open Earth observation data to address our most pressing global challenges. Her vision for the advancement of GEO is to introduce agile and innovative approaches to promote broader use of Earth observation data, technologies, and knowledge for social impact. Yana was born and raised in Armenia, where she studied foreign languages and became involved in international development and working with underprivileged communities as a young adult. She is an international relations expert whose career spans humanitarian relief and development, international think tanks, and government organizations. In her own words, she expresses her commitment to harnessing the power of data to address global challenges by saying, any outcome worth achieving takes commitment and perseverance. I am at GEO with my GEO family for the long haul, to see communities benefit from the enormous public and private investments made into science and technology. Can't wait to hear from you, Yana, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Connie. I'm going to probably change things up a little bit following from the first speaker and use just a simple set of slides if the system allows me, and it doesn't look like it's going to allow me. So never mind, I'm not going to use the slides. I'll just speak without them. One correction to the introduction that was made, for the record, we are based in Geneva, Switzerland, the Secretariat of the Group on Earth Observations, but our members are all over the globe, including the United States. We are a global partnership that today includes 114 countries and over 140 participating organizations that span the entire information value chain and include public, private, non-governmental sectors and the civil society. So by means of introduction, I want to mention some of the personal data that's available to me as of this morning through my phone, on my watch, through my computer. There's data on how much I slept, and that's not nearly enough given the time of today's session. How many steps I took, which has been not so bad given the heat wave that we're experiencing here in Geneva, Switzerland, which is quite uncommon, but I guess we can expect more of these events. How much quiet time I had in the office last week, and that was next to none. There is a huge amount of data analysis out there, and it can make us think, feel, and act in different ways. We can feel pressured, or we can use it as an incentive to act, to change our behavior patterns, and achieve results. The same can be said of the global challenges that we're facing right now. There's a huge amount of data available on climate change, disasters, biodiversity. Much of this information is not good news. And frankly speaking, if I were a government decision maker right now, I would feel entirely overwhelmed. So how do we tackle global challenges in the age of digital transformation and help the decision makers not to feel overwhelmed, but empowered to act? We saw how people came together to collaborate when COVID-19 crisis struck. We know that data sharing can move mountains and accelerate action. So how can we respond to the longer term but equally pressing crises of climate, biodiversity, and others? We are, of course, in the era of big data with petabytes of data from Earth observation, satellites alone streaming overhead. They say that 90% of the information ever generated was created in the past 2 years. And yet, this fire hose of data has not equaled increased knowledge and capacity for action. We know that the political decisions are not keeping up with the pace of the change. In fact, while Earth observation data is in itself a huge opportunity, it has also created a large challenge, with the nations lacking the capacity to discover, access, and effectively use this information to drive proactive and effective sustainable development policies. That is not to say that there are no gaps in data or technology. Of course, there are large gaps with regards to in situ data. There are limitations in artificial intelligence processes, particularly with processing data from multiple sources. And it is still the least vulnerable, the have-nots, who have the least access to data. Bridging this digital divide, especially in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, is one of the paramount mission objectives of the Group on Earth observations. But the main problem really we're facing today as a society is that an abundance of data is not currently translating to an abundance of solutions. We need to get intelligence in the form of actionable knowledge out of this data revolution and equip those on the front lines of conservation and sustainable development, namely those operating on national and local scales, with the tools and technologies to streamline optimization and exploitation of this data. So how do we help them in this age of digital transformation? Well, the foundations still need to be there. The fundamentals such as power, connectivity, data infrastructure, standards, security layers. These are what we build upon. But we need to allow countries to leapfrog the resource and capacity intensive stages of data processing and management and jump to insights and evidence extraction for decision. The mission of GEO is to develop and provide digital public goods that create open knowledge that can be reproduced around the world by any community, from scientists to non-expert users, to answer very tailored specific challenges and questions. We need to extract the right information from this deluge of data, especially for the more complex topics that require multi-source, multi-type, and not just Earth observation. For this, we need to bring scientists, technologists, policymakers, and end users to make that magic happen. These days, and especially in our Earth observation community, but I trust in other professional communities as well, we speak often and a lot about the need for co-design and co-creation. We say that innovation must be transdisciplinary, inclusive, collaborative. This means connecting producers and users, encouraging interactions between them. A lot of my work at GEO is about managing the boundaries between these various groups. And I like to refer to us as boundary spanners. As we build bridges and partnerships with these various groups and connect with stakeholders, this helps us not only to pool knowledge, but also to build social capital. It's this social capital that in turn builds trust, that allows us to innovate, problem solve together, co-create for impact, because we envision it together. This cooperation can lead to real results. Not too long ago, I heard of one example of how one of our services, the GeoGLOS streamflow forecast service, which provides advanced flooding forecast, provided a very impactful result in very real sense. GeoGLOS service, like I said, provides advanced floods forecast based on global data. And it was used by the authorities in Israel and Palestine, where there was obviously certain issues related to trust and sharing local data across boundaries. So they relied on the service that was provided by this international organization, GEO, which by them was viewed as a neutral, trusted broker, and allowed them to make timely decisions for preventative action and prevent flood damage. This cooperation isn't just between scientists and government authorities. We're also seeking to build trust through our collaboration with the private sector. We know at the country, national, and subnational level, there may be less appetite to use third-party data. So how can we ensure that countries are making use of all data that's being made available? Again, it goes back to laying that foundation of trust. Private sector is one entity that often is argued about in terms of entering into the space of providing services to low and middle income countries. Can their services be trusted? Can they be reliable in the long term? We have launched a series of partnerships with the private sector across the value chain, frankly. One such partnership that we launched 2 years ago was with Google Earth. 2 years later, 32 projects from 22 countries have been awarded production licenses and technical support to tackle some of the world's greatest challenges, and especially those that are relevant to those countries for their national and local context, using open geospatial data. And if you want to hear more about this fascinating results actually that came from this project, I can recommend tuning into Google Earth's lightning talk on this collaboration that happens later this week. So how can we bring these promising advances to bear at scale when tackling some of the thorniest global challenges? So how do we unlock action? Perhaps I will also use one example of our partnership that we're seeking to accelerate, and that is GeoWetlands initiative. We know there is a massive opportunity here. Wetlands really do speak to a whole number of SDG targets. If we look at targets SDG 14 and SDG 15, the entire biosphere, wetlands play a prominent role in those two SDGs, but they're also connected to a whole host of others. Climate change, food security, water. Wetlands provide ecosystem services, including fresh water and food, worth an estimated $47 trillion a year. They have massive potential to contribute to climate change mitigation, given their carbon sequestration function. Protecting 53.2 million hectares of coastal wetlands globally would secure an estimated 10.6 to 12.1 gigatons of carbon. Just think about that. This one ecosystem having that kind of impact on our climate mitigation efforts. There are also dynamic ecosystems. So countries, communities, and investors need reliable data on their changing water levels, vegetation growth, and other indicators in order to plan and implement conservation and restoration efforts. But the data on wetlands is often difficult to find and hard to use. And this is not for the lack of investment so far. Multiple projects and millions of dollars have been dedicated to monitoring wetlands. And yet, these efforts have not resulted in a great number of countries having their national wetlands inventories. Decision makers at the regional and global scale still do not have consistent access to data to monitor wetlands. So in response, we want to develop an integrated Earth observation-based tools and services that provide consistent, standardized information needed for improved wetlands conservation and accelerated restoration. I mentioned a whole multitude of projects that exist around the world. They are based on solid science. They've been pooling investments for years and years and years. So what's our role in this? Well, we look to bring international collaboration with all of these entities who've been developing information services and monitoring services for wetlands in the way that will create through standardized, consistent methodology so that decisions everywhere, no matter where they get the data on wetlands from, can count on that information. So that if you are an impact investor wanting to develop projects on wetlands and support local communities in different parts of the world, you can be looking at the various parcels and the various wetlands and know that you are getting consistent, comparable results. So, and how would we measure success if we are to do this? I think it will be in the eye of the end user. Remember, I began by saying, as a decision maker and an end user today, you can be overwhelmed by the grandness of the challenges, by the amount of data that's coming at you from this fire hose, and that we need and want to make the decision makers feel empowered. And so I would foresee that our success in this endeavor would look like that a decision maker, rather than waking up to read another bulletin of bad news, or waking up to a deluge of new data that may work for some but may not work for others, I want to see people waking up to say, yes, I know where I can find my information to guide my restoration efforts for maximum impact. Yes, I can report to global processes such as the Ramsar Convention. And yes, I have a way to report on how what I'm doing is proving beneficial and providing a nature-based solution, and is sequestering carbon, and is reversing biodiversity loss, and will help me unlock the financial flows needed to sustain these efforts. This project, as well as several others that we geo-coordinate with the global community of data scientists, earth scientists, technologists, in consultation with policy communities, gives me real hope. I mentioned that when we build partnerships, we build social capital. It is this social capital that gives me this faith and confidence, because in the end, everything we do is a grand experiment. And like any experiment, our efforts can fail or lead to unexpected findings. But through this process of building social capital, we can deliver the solutions for end users, because if we fail, we just bounce back and we try again because we trust one another. So let's keep experimenting. Let's be building bridges, and keep thinking about those end users waking up in the morning. So Connie, I turn this back over to you.
Thank you very much, Yana, and apologies for mislocating you in the US. So you're in Geneva and you tell us that there's a big heat wave over there. I was just in Pretoria, and it's freezing in Pretoria. So there you are. Thank you so much for highlighting the great amounts of data that are being collected all over the world, and how making data publicly available can make a difference in making progress towards the SDG targets. As you say, though, apparently part of the problem is this abundance of data that does not translate into an abundance of solutions. And the question still remains, how much more can we do, especially in this digital age that provides so many possibilities for not only collecting that data, but also bringing this to solutions to our global challenges. Thank you very much, Yana. Looking forward to speaking to you a little later. Our final speaker is Dr. Claire Melamed, who is the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. She will address the science and policy interface through her take on the role of data for global challenges. And according to her, data is only useful if it's used. And that is why we need politicians to care about data. Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, the organization that she heads, brings together several hundred members from government, private sector, and civil society to harness and leverage data and data technology towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, making her a perfect speaker for this panel. Prior to joining this global partnership, Dr. Melamed was previously the managing director of the Overseas Development Institute, and in 2014, she worked on the report, A World That Counts. And Dr. Melamed is an active researcher and is affiliated with a number of research institutes, as well as serving on various advisory boards. She too, unfortunately, was unable to join us either in person or virtually, so we will listen to a pre-recorded talk if the technical team is ready to run it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A very warm hello to all of you attending International Data Week, whether that is in person in Seoul or virtually as I am all around the world. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you today, but I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts from our experience here at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And I know that my colleague Karen Bett is going to join you later on the panel. My name's Claire Melamed, and I'm the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. We're an organization which exists to put data to work to solve some of the most critical challenges of our time. So the topic of today's panel is absolutely at the heart of what we do. I think the first thing, as we're thinking about the role of data to address global challenges, is to recognize that the challenges that we face are huge, as I'm sure many of you have already discussed during this first day of the conference. Just to give one example, potentially the most existential of the many crises that seem to be converging in the world at the moment, the latest IPCC report on climate change shows through data exactly how bleak our situation is. Now, we all know, I think we're all united in this virtual and real room by an understanding that data is absolutely critical in helping governments, in helping companies, in helping individuals to solve those challenges. But let's understand exactly what the particular challenge is in relation to data. While there's a lot to find out, and there are many ways in which our current understanding of the world can be improved, there is already plenty of data. Just a cursory look around the internet shows in the area of climate how many different platforms and portals exist to share data, to visualize data, to illustrate in so many different, often very beautiful and very moving and very stark ways, the reality of the climate crisis that we're facing. The reason why action is not being taken is not because we don't have the data. We absolutely do. The challenge really is much more getting the data used where it needs to be. And in our work at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, we found that really there are three key areas, three key levels to think about as we're thinking about how to get data used, how to make sure that the huge efforts of the academics, of the engineers, of the computer scientists, of the citizens who are sharing their own views through data really penetrate to where they're needed to be and influence policy. I'm going to start with politics. We often think of data as a technical issue, and of course it is. It has to be accurate, it has to be rigorous, it has to be done in ways that meet international standards of accuracy and replicability. But it also has to get to the desk of the politician who can make the decision. And I think, all of us understand that we're now working in a world, shockingly, I think, to some, where it's not obvious and it's not taken for granted that politicians are necessarily going to want to use data. Many are almost glorying in avoiding data, avoiding the facts, and arguing instead on the basis of emotion and what has come awfully to be known as fake news. But there are politicians in the world who understand that data is a critical part of their toolkit, not just to do the technical, practical things they want to do, but also politically. If you want to deliver for your citizens, if you want to meet their aspirations and ultimately win their trust and their votes, then data can help you do that. And I think we all need to start making the argument politically that data is not just a technical thing, but data is something which politicians, and we need to expect that our political leaders should be using data. This quote here is from our board member, the Vice President of the Republic of Ghana, who has been one of the loudest and strongest voices in arguing the politicians' self-interest in relation to data and the fact that data can help politicians to do the things that they need to do. A second area where we absolutely need data to become far more embedded in practice and in the things that we do is in the area of institutions. Again, often as we work in the Global Partnership, and I know as many of you are also involved in many projects and programs and research involving data, we tend to lose sight of the fact that data is something that has to also be embedded within institutions. Data has power not just as a toolkit for political action, but also as a source of influence and control within institutions. And too often, I think we're all used to a situation where data is hoarded, data is not shared, data is seen as a source of power to be guarded rather than as a source of power to be shared and to be used collectively. If we're really going to make the best use of the data that we have, and if we're going to use it to solve all the global challenges, then as well as thinking politically, we also need to think institutionally. How can we equip the institutions on which we all depend, whether they're the departments of a single government, whether they are the agencies of the United Nations, whether they are the civil society organizations doing work at the local level for those affected by the sharp end of all of these global challenges that we face. How can those institutions be equipped to use data? How can they have how can the people within them have the skills that are needed to be able to use data, to be able to make decisions with data, to be able to even understand what it is that they need and what the potential is and where investments should be made? And how can we also help to address some of the power issues within institutions that sometimes stop data sharing, that sometimes lead to data hoarding, to data silos, to institutions being reluctant to, as they see it, give away some of their control over the data, and instead move to a mindset where people all understand that by giving up control, we create so much more power that will help all of us to address the challenges that we face. And here again, a colleague that we've worked with closely in the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics during the time of COVID, the last huge global crisis that we faced, that of course many of us are still very much in. Data sharing became an absolutely essential part of governments understanding what was going on, sharing data between ministries of health, ministries of transport, ministries of the economy, and so on. And I think many people involved in that effort confronted the reality that, as Lola says here, sometimes there's a sense within institutions that if you share the data, you're giving up control and power. Whereas in fact, the reality is the opposite. By sharing data, you're creating power, because when that data is shared and combined with others, it becomes so much more insightful and can do so much more. The third challenge, and the challenge in a way which underpins all of the others and is the key that can unlock all of the others, is making sure that we all understand how data fits into stories and how data is a part of the stories that we all tell. We often see data as a fairly technical thing, concerned with numbers, concerned with algorithms, concerned with survey methodologies and so on. And of course, that is the critical underpinning of data. But at the heart of it, data is just about people. Data starts with people. A huge amount of the data that we use in the field of development comes from surveys, and surveys are a conversation. Surveys are two people sitting together, often under a tree, at a desk, and talking about their lives and recording those things that seem to be most important. Data is all about people. And if we want to use data, if we want to be able to encourage our institutions to invest in data, to work together in the ways that are needed to make the best of data, and if we want our leaders to use data to make their decisions, to invest in data, to allocate the resources that are needed, and to compete on the basis of facts, then we all have to understand that data is a part of all of our stories. Data at the heart is about improving people's lives like these two women in Senegal, where we worked with the government of Senegal to use Earth observations data from satellites, often one of the most technical kinds of data, it seems, to improve the distribution of climate-resistant crops and improve lives for everybody. Data is at the heart about stories. And if we're going to use data to solve our global challenges, then we need to tell the stories that will encourage the politicians and the institutions to use that data in the best possible way. If they're going to do that, it's up to all of us to persuade them and to make them want to. I thank you very, very much for listening. I hope you have a great discussion and very much look forward to interacting with all of you in the future. Thank you very much indeed.
A big thank you to Dr. Melamed for that presentation. And as I have mentioned before, if you have any questions or comments, please do drop them in our Q&A section. And in case you are just joining us, the aim of this panel is to discuss the role of data in addressing global challenges. We have listened to talks by Dr. Murray, who heads the institute that coordinates the Global Burden of Disease study, and who outlined the speedy response of the global community to monitor, model, and predict the course of the global pandemic, and the critical role of available data in that process. After him, we listened to Ms. Gyan, Yana, who advocates for helping those left behind to be enabled to leapfrog the resource-intensive process of data collection and management and access the benefits of the information that can be obtained from publicly available data. Just now, we listened to Dr. Melamed, who says that for data to be of any use, politicians have to care about it. And so the data community needs to take the necessary steps to engage as needed. And that in the end, data is really about stories. And these are stories that need to be told. I'd like to open this up to questions from participants. And I hope Simon and Hannah, you are on the ground to pick up questions from the physical audience. I suppose you'll drop them in the Q&A, or I'll be guided on that. But before that, I have a few questions for our panel discussants. And Ms. Ayana and myself will be joined by Ms. Karen Bett, who is the policy manager for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, where she works on advancing their policy work on data equity and inclusion. Ms. Bett has spent over 10 years working in international development and completed her MA in economics, specializing in health economics and public finance at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Ms. Bett, you're joining us from Nairobi, and if I may, Karen, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Connie.
Thanks a lot. To get us started, I would like to direct my first question to you, Yana. And one thing that you emphasized, and Dr. Melamed did the same, is that there's actually an abundance of data, but that the problem is around translating that data to solutions. GEO has already made big strides in utilizing this available data, but I can imagine that there are many more opportunities that exist in utilizing and integrating the data that we already have. And you mentioned one project on wetlands, but perhaps you can comment on some general principles involved in pulling off such integrations and collaborations. Yana.
Thanks very much, Connie. Well, look, you know, we're pretty fortunate as this partnership to have among us in our family organizations that frankly are far more qualified to take this question and answer it in detail, but organizations like CODATA, International Science Council, Future Earth, and many, many others who work with data and on data integration and extraction of knowledge. But effectively, and this has been part of GEO's core mission, for data to be used for extraction of insights, it absolutely has to be based on solid data management principles. There has to be metadata available that is constantly updated, curated. Our community has been providing guidance on data sharing and data management principles to ensure that the efforts around the world are consistent in this space. Data needs to be machine readable so that it can be, in fact, used and integrated into various systems, including GIS systems, which are the systems that integrate various layers and various types of data to visualize it for decision makers. Our community also is working to make data analysis ready, especially satellite data, big data, so that it can be ready for extraction of tailored information for a particular area, for a particular issue. So all of these efforts, while certainly not trivial, they are foundational, and in many contexts, in many parts of governments, they are in fact even supported by legislation that mandate data providers and organizations that hold on to a lot of data to make them not only available for with open data policies, but be managed in the way that they can be used for these integrated purposes. But still, that's not necessarily enough to say, once we ensure that there are good metadata records for essential data, that the standards are in place, that data is mission readable, all of this will lead to insight extraction and knowledge creation. We know that in reality, it is working with the end users that creates those processes that take data through data analytics, through visualization, and to packaging for decision making. We're using SDG here for this conversation as the framework, and the group on Earth observation has been working with various policy side organizations like UN Habitat, for example, on SDGs related to resilient cities and human settlements. And we have created a toolkit that actually integrates Earth observation data with statistical data, demographics data, socioeconomic data, that includes information on sort of vulnerable populations, in order to be able to look at where temperature fluxes could prove to be most damaging to what populations. All of that providing the necessary insight to urban planners and other policymakers to take the right decisions. This effort, creating this toolkit, which is entirely open for reproduction and reproducibility, has been created very much in concert with organizations that represent those local municipalities, Covenant of the Mayors, ICLEI, etc. So I'll leave it here and see if perhaps Karen has anything to add.
Thanks, Yana. Karen, you can definitely add on to Yana's remarks. And for you, I would nevertheless, I mean, Dr. Mari also mentioned it, that in their response to COVID-19, they did find still some data gaps. And I think, Yana, you would agree that there are definitely some disciplines and some geographies where data is still not as abundant or as accessible, even though it is collected. And Karen, perhaps you can throw more insight on this, given that your organization helps low and middle income countries collect data for the SDGs or coordinate those partnerships. What still needs to be done urgently in the next 8 years, Karen, for us to really get the data with which we can do the science that really can move the needle on the SDG targets? Karen.
Thanks so much, Connie, and real pleasure to be here, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah, you're correct in saying we're not on track in all the countries equally across the geographies in at least measuring or even achieving the goals. And I think building from what Yana mentioned, we have various data sources, Earth observation, citizen science, big data, which we can actually harness and socialize, if I may, as accurate, comprehensive, and of good quality data sources that can help us measure and track the goals. The fact that national statistical offices are the custodians of data and responsible for measuring the goals, by default or often, they would look at official sources as the data source to measure the goals. But actually, these other data sources, Earth observation, as I mentioned, citizen science, are equally good and are equally, very accurate and fit for purpose for measuring the goals. So for me, I see if we socialize, if we accelerate our efforts to ensure that these data sources can be used, are used for measuring the goals, I think that would be one way that we can actually accelerate, our progress towards the goal. And so, national statistical offices have then developed frameworks of data quality, which then enables them to use these other data sources. Other countries have revised their laws to ensure that they can accept these data sources. So you can imagine some of these things were enshrined in law that, we can't use data from non-official sources for official purposes. But the world has changed. There's that appreciation and recognition that these data sources are useful. But, I use the word quality, and I want to, expand or unpack quality more. I think when you talk about quality, it goes more than just the methodologies. It's about how we govern the data, who has access to it, how it's used, but also how we determine or how inclusive are the approaches that we use in generating data. And by inclusive approaches, we're ensuring that people are able to participate across the data value chain, not just as respondents, but actually even in determining the questions that need to be asked. So, and also in analyzing, in collecting the data and in determining the policy action. So really taking a more inclusive approach is also a measure of quality. I think to add, and Yana, I know you mentioned this also, just to emphasize really the importance of capacity. You know, these are new, these are innovative, these are alternative, and even call it non-traditional data sources, you know. So the custodians of the SDGs, which is government, have, you know, need that requisite skills to be able to integrate these data sources. But that's just one half of it. You know, the producers of these data sources also need to know the gaps that need to be filled. We could be more efficient in ensuring that the data that we collect is actually filling the gaps that we need. And sometimes, you know, it's about either repurposing the data, reusing the data, or, you know, collecting new data if needed to ensure that we're actually closing the gaps. Lastly, and this is really where the global partnership comes in, is collaboration. When we were established, you know, it was, the idea was to ensure that we have that common voice, common effort to accelerate, and you know, achieving or even measuring the goals will be tricky if we don't collaborate, so that we can all together accelerate the agency, but also accepting that individually, as countries, as institutions, as citizens, we can't do it alone. We can't achieve the SDGs alone. We need that collaborative effort. Back to you, Connie.
Thanks a lot, Karen. And I couldn't agree more. Certainly, to respond to our global challenges, we need the inclusion of all that are affected anyway, to really understand what the issue is and to collect the data that will move us towards responding to those issues. I wonder if there are any questions from the floor. Host. Any questions from the floor in Seoul, or I'm happy to continue. If there are none, Karen and Yana, I'd like to ask you another question here, and that is, as a person who's working with the International Science Council on trying to figure out a new way of gathering data or doing science towards the SDG, towards achieving the SDG goals, where more context can be taken into account. I see that there's a question from the audience, so please, if you can type it in the chat or give me 2 seconds. Let me just finish this question. Maybe you can just park it while we see what the question is from the audience. And the question is, what advice would you give the ISC in designing this mission-driven science? So the idea behind mission-driven science is that for regions, for instance, the East African region or the North African region, as you can imagine, they may face peculiar climate, food interactions, or in West Africa, you might find that the social setup, perhaps they have conflict, or they have ethnic or economic wars. Those might interact differently with climate issues or interact differently with production. So the mission-driven science is all about doing the science at those regional levels, which can better understand what solutions are needed to move the needle towards achieving the SDG goals, and override the issues that countries have in doing the science that is needed to really understand how they can respond to the SDGs. And also different from science that is done at a global level that overgeneralizes possibly. So what advice would you give the International Science Council on how we can design this kind of studies, and how we can use available data or collect new data towards that effort? So I'll just park that question with you, and I'll also listen to the question from the audience.
Connie, do you want a question for the floor?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I put my hand up, and then you moved on, and I've
I'm so
stood
sorry,
up,
I
which is,
missed it.
so hi Connie, it's Simon Hodgson from CoData. I raised this question in some of our discussions before this plenary, but so it'll be familiar to you. Obviously, on one level, I completely agree with the very powerful message from Claire that we need to think about how the data is used and how ensuring the data, or more accurately, the information and the policy implications of the data are used in politics, in institutions, and in narratives. And that's an important message. But it's also funnily one that I find a little bit dangerous, and for reasons that have already been enunciated. Maybe dangerous isn't the right word, but it's only half of the question. It's only half of the issue, for reasons that Karen and Jana have already indicated. There are enormous data gaps. There are some research areas and some data gathering enterprises, of which Earth observations is one, which is on one level incredibly data rich. And we have certain research fields which gather a lot of data. You know, that's incontestable. But also, as Jana indicated, there's so much that needs to be done to that remote sensing data before it can be used effectively, before we extract information of it, and before it becomes policy ready. And Jana cited a really exciting sounded example of that, mixing that remote sensing data with socio-economic data, with vulnerability data, etc. I saw a couple of years ago a fantastic project in Mexico City, which used cadastral data, used some remote sensing data, a lot of geophysical data, but poverty data, architectural data, to try and understand the vulnerability of certain areas in Mexico City for earthquakes. I mean, that's the sort of classic work. But the amount of work that needed to be done to annotate the data, to use the metadata to create those models is enormous. And I rather feel that Claire's message implies we've got the data, we just need to make sure it's used. And I think that's, I'd put it a little bit differently, which is that we need to invest heavily in data stewardship. We need to invest heavily in making data fair, so it's machine actionable. But we also need to invest in ensuring the data is in the narrative. And I'd sooner sort of a more balanced narrative about that, if you like. And I'm afraid that's a comment rather than a question, but I suppose I can add a coda of a question to that comment, which is to invite yourself and Jana and Karen to comment on that balance. And maybe to respond to the question you made about what can ISC do in terms of mission-driven science, my question is, where are the data gaps? And where are the gaps in terms of the steps from data to information to policy? And that, to my mind, should be the mission. How do we identify the gaps? How do we gather the data in a way that involves, that's transdisciplinary, that involves the people involved in eventual changes and policymaking? And how do we identify from those data and that information, how do we identify the policy changes that need to be made? And it has to be the whole process. There's no scientists that are going to do all of those steps, but scientists need to work closely with policymakers and institutions to make sure that those changes are made. So that was rather a long intervention, but hopefully it struck a couple of chords in what's already been said.
Thank you very much, Simon. A very helpful and important addition. Thank you very much for that insight. And I suppose Jana and Ms. Brett Karen can also weigh in on that perspective. And thank you very much also for responding a little bit to what the ISC can do about figuring out indeed where the data gaps are and how we can move from data to information or the science to policy action. And in the next 8 years, we really have no time at all. And so I think this is a very timely discussion that we're having here at the Data Week. Karen, Jana. Maybe we will start with, would you like to start, Jana?
Sure. I think I think there is a way to weave actually both your question and Simon's in a way, because I find it's a bit difficult to sort of answer Simon's question in sort of one comprehensive way, because I really do think that one size doesn't fit all the time, every time. You know, so we know there are certain observations that currently have, you know, gaps, but they are essential basic observations, such as sort of meteorological data, meteorological observations, that when they don't exist, a whole number of questions cannot be answered with great degree of accuracy, although satellite data does come in as a proxy oftentimes. And to address those kind of data gaps, organizations such as World Meteorological Organization in partnership with UNDP and UNEP are currently beginning to tackle by, let's say, you know, with their latest initiatives, sustained, you know, so I'm so used to acronyms now that I forget what they stand for. SOF, right? Sustainable Observations Financing Facility. So it's a massive initiative where governments, and not only governments, are pledging their support on the order of 400 million to actually fill those observation gaps, to provide consistent meteorological, local meteorological and other weather observations. So these are basic observations. And then there are the various sort of global processes that we've captured in frameworks such as SDG, but their local application is obviously going to be different. And I think this is where your question, Connie, came with you know, complex intersections and interactions of, let's say, food production, food security, and you know, water resource management. And how can systems, data and systems be integrated through scientific approaches as well, right? Because it requires integration of scientific data, it requires integration of systems to be able to provide answers to those complex integrated issues. And I think based on our observation in the Group on Earth observation, the best cases have come, especially at the regional level, when these questions were begun to be answered in concert with the stakeholders, the various ministries. We have a fantastic case with Digital Earth Africa, and currently in the Pacific with Digital Earth Pacific, where communities of data providers, scientists, technologists are sitting down through a series of engagements and dialogues and workshops with the various ministries, and not individual, but with the sort of a whole of government approach, in order to really understand what is the scale of the issue, what is the scale of the information and knowledge gap in the particular region, so that the data infrastructure that is the Digital Earth, whether it's for Africa or for Pacific, can be developed in response to those very specific needs. So we know there are certain blueprints, there are certain practices that are common across all contexts, but for these solutions to really be meaningful for those particular local contexts, which really have to account for social and cultural contexts, they have to be developed in concert with those end user communities. And so not something that perhaps we do holistically and systematically, but I think it's also quite important for us to be embedding science communities with NGOs and civil societies that are actually doing work on the ground. Because and it will be critical in informing both sides and both ways. So, we know there are massive efforts for reforestation, where in all parts of the world, there are big efforts of planting trees. Are they always the right types of trees? Are they always being planted in the right places? Are we sure that these trees are going to be there 5 years down the road? That is where the embedding of the science community in those civil society and NGO efforts to guide those reforestation efforts would be absolutely essential. And vice versa. How robustly does the science community gather information from those boots on the ground, if you will, to really know what kind of practices they need to be informed in the science? So, and I think in this lies the very challenge that we wish there could be one kind of a scattergun approach to answering these questions, because we all want our efforts to be accelerated for accelerated impact. But it does require some of that precision and tailoring so that we know exactly what context we're dealing with. Are we dealing with lack of data? Are we dealing with lack of technical capacity to use the data? But in the end, I think one thing holds true for all contexts is that data needs to be open as much as possible. Sure, we know there are contexts and places where local data will not be made available, open and free. But as much as possible, data needs to be open. Standards need to be open. And the more open science is being made available, codes need to be open, the more it will drive innovation, improvement of scientific outputs. And that is really the ethos of GEO, is to drive open science, open knowledge based on open data, open standards, use open software, so that it can then drive innovation and drive improvement of scientific outputs and then the actual outputs for application. So I don't know to what extent that really answers the question. I wish there was just one answer for all questions, but I do think it is unfortunately more complex, and therefore does require sort of that complex ecosystem of stakeholders to be put in place, information sources to be put in place. So I'll pause here.
Sure. Thanks, Yana. I certainly need a coordinated effort, that's for sure. We have only 2-3 minutes to the end of this panel, and Karen, if you can just give us a minute or so to also contribute to this question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Connie, and I'll be very brief because Yana has said all the important comments. But I think, thinking about the mission-driven science and also, other initiatives, I think really the spirit, and which is why I appreciate this, is that it enables communities, people who remain invisible, to get a chance to be visible, or at least, be seen. And, there are many ways, or there are many reasons why people remain invisible. And I'll just give one quick example. A child who is under 5 years, has a disability, lives in a remote community. So government is unable to reach that community, maybe due to access, due to distance. But even when it does, disability surveys are not conducted as regularly as other surveys. Even when disability surveys are done, it doesn't capture disability of children below the years of 5. So I think really this mission-driven science, I could also say mission-driven data, really is taking that intersectional lens. It's taking the perspective of the local needs, but also prioritizing that. And I think that's commendable. A localization agenda is about communities participating in the data value chain, across the data value chain, but also it's elevating the value and the data that is collected at the local level. And I think that's what Yana, you were alluding to about communities and scientists working together. And I think also, the statistics you were giving, Connie, at the beginning around the difference between the North and the South when it comes to the scientific community, the amount of money we put into science, that is really, and this mission-driven is really helping to close that, promote the localization agenda rather. But I must say, and as I finish, there still needs to be that balance, balance context. Context gives us nuance, gives us voices, or give us, stories or the issues on the ground. But at the end of the day, when we want to compare, when we want to measure the goals, there's also that value of, going a notch higher and enabling comparison, either across communities, across countries or subnational governments, and across regions. So I think, and I believe the mission-driven science is really about also balancing that context, but also comparability, because comparability also helps us to know where we need to put much more effort. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks, Yana. My thanks to the technical team and the audience. I see that there is another question from the audience. However, I see that we have come to the end of our time. Again, I can be guided, but I believe we really have come to the end of our discussion. Simon, thank you so much for that intervention. Very, very important. And certainly, all in all, we can learn from a lot of initiatives where data has translated to information and translated into policy action, but still a lot needs to be done. There's data that is still missing. Even where data is, there's still questions of science that need to be carried out. And all in all, get to the solutions that can move the needle on the SDG targets. Hosts, is it possible? I believe the session has come to an end now, unless I'm mistaken.
Can I ask a question? Okay, still. My name is Jeff Shim. Oh, I don't know what you're doing, but I'm one of the local organizers here. I'm affiliated Sungkyunkwan University. I'd like to thank all three speakers. My question is to Yana, and you quoted that there's a sense that when you share data, you feel like you lose the control of the data. And you said that in reality is the opposite, that data sharing rather reinforces the control and ownership of data. Can you elaborate on it a little bit more, or can you provide any experience showing that that's indeed was the case?
I believe that was Claire, actually. I think we talked about data silos and data hoarding and people feeling as though they lose control. But perhaps Yana can still comment on it a little bit, or maybe Karen, because Karen is Claire's colleague.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think Claire's comment, and thanks for the question, really was when you share data, you are able to unlock it for others to use it and to reuse. And I think one point definitely is that it's not accurate, or it's not right to share data when it's not anonymized. So you're also thinking about safeguarding, you're thinking about privacy, you're thinking about confidentiality before you share the data. Again, the other spirit, the spirit of data sharing is really to for efficiency. If you want to avoid duplication of data collection, data must be open so that others can use and reuse, rather than multiple data collection efforts. And I think I've seen this particularly with government institutions, where government institutions with non-state actors, where if you go to government and say, organization, I represent organization A, I've collected data on transport, for example. Then the next one, organization B, I've collected data on transport. Organization C, the same. The last thing government representatives will tell you is, are you guys coordinating amongst yourself? Because you're bringing the same data to us, and it's saying the same thing, but it looks like you're not coordinating. So I think the spirit really of data sharing is to enable efficiency, enable coordination among non-state actors. But as I underlined, it should be shared in a way that's data is anonymized, or it's confidential, safeguarding people's identities so that it cannot be misused, or it landing in the wrong hands, then ending up causing more harm than good.
Okay, thanks a lot, Karen. And thank you for that question. I'll bring the session to a close. And again, thank all our presenters. Thank Karen and Yana for being with us here live, for all the in-person audience, and for your attention this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are. And to wish us all a quicker march towards the SDG targets, with the data community working hand in hand with the scientists, and very, very importantly, with the politicians, without whom we cannot really bring those solutions to make an impact on society. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a good continuation of Data Week.